So we're back
Finally. It's
after our
been a
summer hiatus.
while. Yeah. Took the
I think
summer
we're going to
off.
be European. We're going to take summers off.
Well, I think we deserve summers off.
There was a lot of stuff going on too.
I know. I kept thinking we have to have an episode about that. We have to have an episode about that. But I was moving and just got settled in and started the new semester. So
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in your life. I decided teaching 5 classes over the summer was a good idea.
right, that was a lot going on for you. That was ridiculous.
Um yeah, so it's been a busy summer, but we're back. We're back today we're going to be doing like a special episode. I mean, it is a history episode, but it's about 9/11.
Yeah. Which is now a historical event.
Which is in itself frightening. But yeah, it should be fun. We're back though. We're gonna be back now with weekly episodes. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to An Incomplete History.
I'm Hillary.
And I'm Geoff.
And we're your hosts for this weekly history podcast.
So kind of before we jump into the topic, which is 9/11, a weather update. We had a thunderstorm last night. There were 100 lightning strikes in San Diego County last night.
I hope none of them started a fire.
Probably.
Probably, yeah.
We'll see. But it like rained a little bit here, but evidently a little further north, it rained a substantial amount on the coast, right? I live on the coast. We don't get thunderstorms here.
No.
We get them inland in the mountains and the desert. We do not get them here on the coast at all. So it was very odd. Harvey was not pleased at all.
No,
he was
he's
like,
not a thunderstorm boy.
He's like, what is that?
Mm-hmm.
And I was so excited. I like turned all the lights off and silenced everything in the house and opened up the doors so we could like listen to it. It didn't last very long, but it was an event. I mean, we did have weather yesterday, so
that's exciting. Yeah, I mean, that's something to report for sure. I mean, since moving to Florida, I have cried.
Hogtown.
I have cried more than once regarding the weather, which it's the worst weather I've ever lived. I've lived in so many places, and this is the worst weather I've ever lived in.
So Hillary lives in the town that I grew up in, which is Gainesville, Florida. University of Florida is there. But it's funny because people from outside the area don't believe you when you tell them you can set your watch in the summer to the thunderstorms. Like every afternoon, same time, every day, these thunderstorms roll in. And it's predictable.
Is so humid all day long.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is just soaking wet all day long. It is 90 some odd degrees all day long. I mean, it doesn't even get cooler in the evening. No. Sometimes it gets hotter.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hotter at like 5 o'clock than it was at like 1 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And I've literally cried on more than one occasion. And I don't think it's just the pregnancy. I think I'm actually like miserable over this weather. But I've heard it's nice in the winter, so.
It is.
I'm looking forward to that.
And I mean, right after it rains, there's like a 10-minute reprieve you get.
A reprieve from, it's still wet.
It's wet, but there's a little bit of relief before the moisture kind of all evaporates and like you're back to like swamp-like conditions.
It's just the worst. I absolutely hate it. And I've lived in some real janky places in terms of weather. Like I was in central Pennsylvania for a while. I was in southeast Texas for a while. I was in Mississippi for a while. They all have their own weather nonsense. But I would say this is like the most consistently miserable weather I've ever lived in.
Well, this is the worst time of the year also. You're there. Yeah. This is the worst. July, August, September, it is gross. By the middle of September, it starts to get better.
I look forward to this.
And then by October, it's great. It's great weather. But early September can be pretty bad. I mean, I remember being at football games early September football games, and it was just disgusting.
Well, it's
Um,
like a baptism by fire then because I moved in July. So I moved at the
yeah,
worst time.
yeah.
Well, so anyway,
Anyway,
I just keep
so
following Geoff around the country because he had also
yes.
lived in Houston where I lived for a
Well,
little
then
while too.
you're moving to New York next, obviously. Then
Yeah, I might become a pastry chef. We'll see.
interesting segue. So New York City. So tomorrow we're recording this on the 10th. Tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. Um, and as historians, it's an interesting thing because our students now were not alive when that happened.
I did a
Um,
poll in class today. I said, raise your hand if you were alive when 9/11 happened. And I got 3 hands raised. And they said that one said, I was 6 months old, or I was 3 months old. I was, just born.
yeah,
So
yeah.
they don't know it.
Um, so it might as well be the Civil War for some of these students at this point. It is something in the past. So historians, we have to kind of start wrestling with that and figuring out what are we going to do with this? How do we teach this? Um, how do we contextualize it? Is 20 years a long enough time to have some kind of healthy distance from the event? Um, but one of the reasons we wanted to have this kind of conversation today was I have connections myself. I lived in New York. I worked in the investment banking industry. I actually worked in WTC2 for quite a while. Um, and I was there that day. And um, it's interesting in our little conversation before we started recording, Hillary asked if this was going to be a therapy session. And I hope it's not. I honestly don't know. I know a couple of years ago in a US history part two class, which is kind of modern US history, we got to the global war on terror and stuff. And a student asked me about September 11th, and another student brought up a conspiracy theories, and we can talk about those briefly, although I don't want to give too much airtime to those.
When we've actually gone into those in
Yeah.
the conspiracy theory episode. So
And and I started responding and I started to get very emotional and I was like, whoa, like you need to dial this back a little bit. Um, but yeah, September 11th, 2001. It was a Tuesday. It was a gorgeous, gorgeous September day in New York City. The sky was so clear. Not a cloud in the sky. It was warm but not hot. You kind of felt it was the last kind of good day of summer you were going to get before it started to turn to fall. It was a great day. It was primary election day. There was a mayoral race that was going on. So it was the mayoral primaries. Um, and Rudy Giuliani was leaving. He was done as mayor. So there was this whole kind of thing about voting for who would be his replacement. Um, and it was a great day. I mean, this up until things weren't great. It was when I tell you the '90s in New York were amazing. I cannot begin to tell you how amazing they were up till September 11th. I mean,
I
September.
think the 90s in general were a really good time. And I was going to ask you a little bit about that because when September 11th happened, I was in middle school. So I do remember it happening, but I don't have like an adult recollection of it.
Mhm,
Um, but and then of course I grew up as a little kid in the 90s and I remember it was great and I don't think it was just because I was a kid, but because I think it was like this moment historically where the Cold War had finally ended, right? The wall came down. We
mhm,
don't have to do bomb raids anymore. Kids aren't hiding under desks thinking that the H bomb's coming. And it was kind of like this 10-year period of relatively peaceful, a sigh of relief, so to speak, because, the Cold War had been raging for decades and it caused a lot of tension and all this. And you had the space race and all this stuff happening. And the 90s were just kind of like this decade, like that sense of relief that came along with the end of the Cold War only lasted about a decade. And I think that 9/11 is when we all kind of got
mhm.
snapped back into reality. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a fool's paradise we were living in. I think we were naive. And it's funny. So Francis Fukuyama writes this great piece when the Berlin Wall comes down called The End of History
Yeah.
in 89. And it, you can read that piece today and be very like, how are these people so delusional? Because basically there's this whole thing, is this the end of war, right? Are we done with kind of global war? What do we do now? What's the future going to look like? Um, I think we all wanted it to be true. And I think that's the thing is we ignored things in the 90s that went against that narrative and we embraced things that reinforced them. So there are a lot of bad things happened in the 1990s. The United States is there's this bloody war as Yugoslavia breaks up, with racial cleansing and genocide and all these things happening. Um, there's a very anxious situation the United States has with China for quite a few years during the 90s. um, there's this whole anxiety of what's going to happen to the Soviet Union now as it breaks up, what's going to happen to their nuclear arsenal, how the, but we just ignored it all and we turned up the Nirvana and we put our flannel shirts on
We got really excited about the Monica Lewinsky scandal.
and
That's what I
and
remember the most
right
about the 90s.
and we used our AOL 3.5 inch floppy drives and never had to buy floppy disks anymore because AOL would send you one every month to try to get you to sign up, and you just rewrite that and put your own files on it. So it was a very because the internet started to be a thing, very much so, and by the late 90s, it very much is an omnipresent for many industries.
And right alongside of that is 24-hour news networks. Because even though they had existed, I think CNN comes out in the 80s or something, like it wasn't as ubiquitous. Like people weren't actually just watching CNN or C-SPAN all the time. But by the late 90s, it became 24-hour news coverage became really a thing.
See, so this is a point, and you're in good company. A lot of historians argue this that this is the moment kind of the 24-hour news cycle emerges. I disagree. I think it's the first Gulf War. So I remember the first Gulf War, everybody watching CNN constantly
Oh, okay.
to stay because you had the embedded journalist and you were just like, what is this? Um, I do think there's a change that happens in the 24-hour news cycle with September 11th. And I mean, the interesting thing is this I think it becomes less newsy after September 11th. Um, and you get
It
a
becomes
lot
almost
more,
entertainment.
right?
That's a really weird thing to
What is
say,
it?
but
Infotainment.
infotainment. Yeah.
Um, but I mean, the 90s are just, they are an incredible period. I mean, maybe that's a function of me being in my 20s. Maybe it's a function of me having a good job. I mean, the jobs that I had in investment banking were the easiest jobs I ever had in my entire life that just paid an inordinate amount of money compared to what you had to do. I was system support. I was not an analyst or anything like that, an investment banker. So I didn't have any of the stress of that. It was a really good time. Um, I had a great loft in New York City. My husband worked at Princeton, reverse commuted. He had a super easy commute. He had a job he loved there as well. It was a great time. And it was Rick and I would jump on a plane in LaGuardia on Friday afternoon and fly to Bermuda for the weekend. That's how it was just like, and we would do it on the spur of the moment too. It'd be like Friday morning. He'd call me from Princeton and be like, "You want to go to Bermuda this weekend?" I was like, "Yeah, let's do it." And we'd like hop on a plane and go to Bermuda. And we'd be in Bermuda for the weekend. And you could do this in the winter, right? And you'd like leave snowy New York and you'd be in Bermuda and get some sun and some warm-ish weather. Bermuda in the winter is not terribly warm, but it's warmer than New York.
Well, and then you think about, so if you're thinking about that in terms of like pre September 11th, like it was a lot easier to go and get on an airplane.
It was.
It
It
was
was
not, it was
like
not a massive
so
pain in the ass.
so my preferred airport in New York was always LaGuardia because it was the smallest of the three airports. It was super easy to get to, and it was the shortest distance from the entrance to from security to the gate.
Mhm.
It was like super fast. And
And security was
honestly,
pretty lax.
and
I mean,
security was pretty lax. And there would be times I would fly out of LaGuardia. I would get to the airport 30 minutes before my
mhm.
flight, especially if I was just doing carry on. There was no reason to get to the airport earlier than that. And I'd just be on the plane and I'd be wherever I needed to be. And it was fantastic. And the city had a vibrant cultural scene, great restaurants, such good restaurants. For a while, I left banking and became a pastry chef. That's a whole other story. But it was just a really vibrant scene. And there was always something interesting and fun to do in the city. Um, and we really were living at the center of the universe.
Mhm.
New York was the center. It was the epicenter of everything happening. Um, and and then that changed. Um, Frighteningly fast too.
Yeah, I mean, so I think if we're thinking of a timeline, and when we're thinking about September 11th and trying to teach about it, I think it is important to set that context about how important New York City is. Number one, right? You saying it's like the center of the universe and all that. Like, yeah, absolutely. And there were targets in Washington D.C. Of course, one of them was hit, the other was not. And we'll get into talking about how that all went down. But the main target was like trying to hit at the heart of America. I think that that's like the best way to describe it, is because the buildings were so iconic. They were central to, the United States economic system. They were representative of so much in terms of not just the way that they looked being iconic, but that they were the center of our way of life in a way. Like they were kind of representative of our way of life, of capitalism, right? And um, so it was really symbolic that they chose those targets. And I think that setting the context of how important New York was at that time, but then also just how iconic those buildings and those targets were, um, I think that that's important for students to understand too. That it's like I'm trying to think if there's something that is as iconic as the twin towers at the moment. Like what could be that thing? I mean, I just think that that's an important thing to mention to students.
The towers, the symbolism of the towers. The Twin Towers were dedicated in 1973, and it was a decades long kind of project, kind of building these buildings. And my first exposure to the Twin Towers was when I was a child living in Gainesville, Florida. And I went to see a movie in 1976. It was a remake of King Kong. It starred Jessica Lange, and instead of the Empire State Building, it finished the featured the Twin Towers, which were only 3 years old at that point. And I remember first that movie is just it is a guilty pleasure. I guess objectively, it's not a very good movie. I love it though. It's Jessica Lange's kind of premiere. This is her first major role. Um, but the kind of finale of the movie takes place atop one of the twin towers, and it was just stuck in my head and kind of became an obsession because I there was something about these buildings I found incredibly beautiful and modern, and
When they were taller than the Empire State Building, right?
by
They
by
were the
yeah,
tallest buildings
these were
in
the
the
tallest
skyline,
buildings.
and they made the New York skyline for
Lower
me
Manhattan,
growing
Lower
up.
Manhattan.
Well,
Right.
yeah,
So
I
we
mean,
have
but I remember seeing, pictures of New York. I saw them. I have pictures from when I went and visited when I was a kid, and I took so many pictures of the buildings because I just thought they were so cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and this is the thing is the for Lower Manhattan, it's ubiquitous. And for pictures of New York City, it was as well. Now, when you're in the city itself, Lower Manhattan has a lot of development skyscraper wise, and then there's kind of um, the Lower East Side, Lower West Side, Chelsea, places like that, where there are largest buildings. They would actually be large in any other city, but for New York, they're fairly small. And then you get to Midtown, where there are more kind of skyscrapers. But the Twin Towers definitely dominate the Lower Manhattan skyline. They are designed by this architect Yamasaki, and in the first interesting but not kind of nefarious connection, Yamasaki, when he got this job, had previously designed Dhahran International Airport in Saudi Arabia, which was contracted by the Saudi bin Laden group. This is Osama bin Laden's family. So Yamasaki designed this major airport for Osama bin Laden's family and the World Trade Center. Conspiracy theorists have a field day with that.
Oh, really?
Um, but one thing Yamasaki did in the design of the towers, and a lot of people don't know this, he took a lot of inspiration from his time in Saudi Arabia, kind of looking at Arabic architecture, and he incorporates those features into the towers. So the towers are really a marvel of modern design because they wanted to maximize internal office space. And they already knew they're going to have these really tall towers. They're going to need a huge elevator bank in the center of the building. Well, if you're going to have girders as well, you're going to end up with very little office space. So what he actually does is does this exoskeleton kind of construction. So the two supporting features of the tower are the central concrete elevator shaft and then the exoskeleton. So those you have these metal bars on the outside, and they're actually supporting features. They actually support the weight of the building. But down towards the lobby level, they flare out into pointed arches. So there's all these elements of Arabic architecture that Yamasaki incorporates into the towers. There's this huge plaza in the middle, which is just gorgeous. And prior to the construction of the Vista Hotel, which Yamasaki really opposed. So eventually this hotel gets constructed, which kind of sits between the towers a little bit. It's not technically between them, but it actually blocks the view between them because prior to its construction, you could stand in the plaza and look between the towers out into New York Harbor. So there's this kind of gateway, and the buildings were gorgeous. And what's strange is, and I had lived in New York for some time, and the weekend before September 11th, so this would have been the 8th or 9th, I so I'm an early adopter of technology, and I had a digital camera, and it was not very good quality, but it was okay quality. For the time, it was really good quality. Um, I was out taking pictures on the Hudson River, and for some reason, before we kind of went home that afternoon, I turned and looked down at the towers and took a picture because I was like, oh, I just love those buildings. Um, I just love them because their simplicity. There's just it's so American, I think, in many ways. And it's odd, that I decided to take that picture that 2 days later, they wouldn't be there anymore. But, these towers represented New York City. They represented American capitalism, um, American prowess, politically,
They
economically.
represented American excess,
Hmm.
right?
I
They
guess,
did. They did.
but
I
how
think
are they
so.
excess? How are
Because
they
they're
excessive?
huge. They're the tallest in the
Oh yeah,
skyline, and that's what I mean. It's like
but they
I'm
weren't
not saying it
tacky.
in a negative manner. No, I don't think it was tacky. I think it was just they were mighty large structures in the
Can
middle
you
of an already mightily large city.
Can you imagine what they
Skyscrapers.
would have looked like if that idiot from Queens had any hand in designing them?
Are you talking about
Yes.
is it Robert Caro? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm
No.
talking about the former president of the United States.
Oh my God. Well, yeah,
There would have
no.
been gold and pink
No, he doesn't
marble.
design anything. He's never
No, but
designed anything in
right.
his
But I mean,
life.
imagine if he had influence on the way it looked.
Oh yeah, that wouldn't have been
They
good
would have
at
been
all.
just awful looking.
So you took my word excess to mean like gaudy. I didn't mean that. I meant like it just is kind of like a show of our how extra we can be when it comes to making stuff.
Okay.
Because
Yep.
I don't think, and I think that culturally speaking, like that was what they were trying to hit the heart of because they were upset about the American way of life and about capitalism and about Western excess, and et cetera. And so I think that attacking those really iconic structures was kind of just hitting at the heart of like what it is to be an American, and it's like those towers are really representative of that, I think.
Hmm. So, I mean, so I know the official line of why they say they attack it is because of that, but I think a lot of it has to do with if you look at 93, so why do Ramzi Youssef and Ayad Esmo target the World Trade Center in 93? It's punishment for the continued US military presence in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf after Operation Desert Storm. So prior to Desert Storm, the US presence in the Gulf was not very large or sustained. But after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the United States expelling Iraq, um, there became a permanent large scale presence, particularly in places like Saudi Arabia. And for Wahhabists, who are kind of these hardline Sunni Muslims, that is untenable. I mean, these are basically crusaders. It doesn't help the fact that some of the language that was used in the Gulf War sounded like crusader rhetoric, going to
Well,
liberate and
yeah, but the other thing is like many of the people who orchestrated, planned, and carried out the attack were had lived and were educated in the United States for many years.
mhm.
So it's not that they were in that space and offended in that way. It was like they were in this space. They were in the United States space. They were educated in one of them was educated in North Carolina, right? And others, they took flight lessons in San Diego and they were living amongst us here.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's so I'm not so what I'm not saying is their reasons for targeting the towers are complicated. So the 93 attack, it destroys the concourse underneath the towers, parts of it, which was small. It destroyed part of one of the parking structures. There was construction that took some time to complete. 6 people lost their lives in it. More than 1,000 people were injured. Most of the injuries were fairly minor. Um, but what's interesting is um, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, this kind of blind cleric who was the perpetrator of this, he promised that that one day those towers would come down. So, kind of fast forward through the 90s, and we get to September 11th, and these guys took advantage of an American system that wasn't security focused. They boarded flights at places that had even less security than your standard airport. Um, and basically hijacked planes with box cutters. So they knew not to take guns because they knew there's no way they could get those on board. But they took these box cutters, hijacked planes. The great weather in New York, I think, helped them. That was to their advantage. If it'd been stormy weather, maybe they couldn't have made it.
Well, and
Um,
the targets they picked too. I mean, we were talking about how they're iconic and they look like this and look like that. Like from a speaking from like a amateur pilot perspective, maybe they were like the easiest targets in the New York skyline.
mhm, yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do
Oh,
something like
yeah.
that,
They
but I mean,
are.
I know
Yeah.
that they're skilled, that obviously skilled, like they know how to fly the plane, but like they're very like those are pretty big targets to be able to zero in on.
So I'm going to give you my experience that morning.
Okay, I'm listening.
Um, I am not. promising everything I say is 100% verifiable what actually transpired in the order it happened. It's funny. One of my really good friends, he was in New York at the time too. We still discuss this, that our memory gets a little foggy on some things. And I think this is about historical memory, right? I mean, this is
That's what's really important about this episode because we've talked so many times about historical memory and how oral history sources can, they be good, but they're also a little hazy. And so this is a great example of what we talked about a lot of times. So
so Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001. It was a primary election day. I worked second shift. I usually worked with the Asian desk. I had just recently moved from lower Manhattan to midtown Manhattan. I'd switched banking groups that I was working with. Um, and I had been working the second shift because I worked with our Asian desk. And I'd gotten home, I think about 1 a.m. And normally I would not have been up this early. But I got up early because I wanted to go vote in the primary election. And then I had a couple of little things I wanted to do. Because Rick and I were planning another trip to Bermuda at the end of the week. It was like we wanted to kind of squeeze out all we could of this summer. And so I was up kind of getting ready, and cell phones were a pretty new thing at this time. And I like showered and got dressed and everything. And I went out, and Rick had like called and left a voicemail on my cell phone. And so I called and got it. And he was like panicked. He's like, "Where are you?" Some kind of plane just crashed in the World Trade Center. And I was like, what is he talking about? So I like got my shoes on and kind of moseyed out. And so he had called just after 8:46 a.m., like just after the first plane had hit. I had a lot of friends that still work down in WTC2, and I went down there a lot to meet them for breakfast or lunch. I still had contacts down there. One of the banks I worked with was still trying to get me to come back down there. And so I went outside, and we lived on 28th Street, which is the old flower market district, between 6th and 7th. So I walked to 7th Avenue and looked down, and you could see the towers. And I looked down at them, and I saw the smoke, the little bit of smoke, and I was like, that's weird. And there was a camera shop on the corner. And I'd gotten this digital camera recently, and I was getting really into it. But I had an old regular analog camera as well. And so I kind of knew the owner, and the owner was standing outside looking as well. And we're talking, and everybody's under the assumption it's a Cessna. Like it's a tiny plane that for whatever reason just went wildly off course and just accidentally struck it. And one of the reasons we think this is because that first plane hits really high between the 93rd and the 99th floor. So very high, almost the very top of a 110-story building that this thing hits. So we assume it's a complete accident. We're standing there just after 9 a.m. The second plane hits, and it hits the South Tower, which we
did you
can't
see it
really.
hit?
We saw the plane, and then we saw the kind of flash, but the way we are, the where we sit, the towers like occlude each other, and it just looks like there's one tower. Um, then we're like, oh shit, like this wasn't an accident. And it was people, people didn't panic, but people were like, what do we do? Um, so I tried to call Rick at that point and couldn't get through because the cell phone lines were just jammed. And so I went back inside and tried to use the land phone. And eventually I got Rick and told him, I'm fine. I'm at the house. I'm not down there. And he was like, what's happening? The news is really unclear what's going on. And I was like, honestly, I don't know. Like the second plane that hit looked pretty big. And he's like, what do you mean? And I was like, it looked like a passenger plane. And so I turned the news on, and we're kind of getting conflicting reports. And I go back outside. And by this point, a lot of people are kind of gathered just looking because What do we do? And slowly people start to filter up into our neighborhood because they pretty quickly closed the ferries. And underneath the World Trade Center, the New Jersey Path, which is the kind of the subway from New Jersey, comes in, and they closed that subway service down there had been suspended, and people are kind of trying to get out of the area, and they're coming up, and less than an hour later, um, WTC2 collapses, and a few minutes after that, I guess it was maybe half hour, the North Tower collapsed as well. And at this point, I think I and a lot of my neighbors, we went into shock. We didn't really know. We weren't even really aware the Pentagon had been hit.
Was it really noisy? Do you remember noises?
I remember noise when the second plane hit. When the towers collapsed, there was some noise, but it wasn't as noisy as I thought it would be. All I remember was the smoke, and for a while, you couldn't see anything. Um, when the
Did you
second
know
tower,
that the tower had collapsed? I'm sorry. Did you realize that that is what had happened when all the smoke came? Or did you think that something else had been hit? Or like, what was your line of
no,
thought?
we were. So the funny thing is, for that almost hour where both towers were still up after they got hit, we all suddenly became engineering experts and decided there was no way these towers were going to come down. That they the way they were designed, because we didn't know about the flights or anything. Turns out both of these flights were transcontinental flights. They were cross country flights, and they were fully loaded with fuel. So the conspirators knew what they were doing. They knew what flights to pick.
That's what's interesting, right? All of these flights were taken from the East Coast and they were all bound for California.
Yep.
So they specifically selected these flights that were going to be loaded up with as much fuel.
And they knew all of these flights on a Tuesday morning were very lightly traveled routes. And so back in the day, you used to be able to get on airplanes, and you would oftentimes find yourself with very few other people on a flight. Airlines didn't pack flights the way they do now, because they had to move planes across the country, and they had to kind of maintain these slots. So it was very interesting that they picked these flights, but we were shocked when the first one collapsed. But then the moment that first one collapsed, which is the second one hit, and that one got hit much lower down, almost the midsection, just above the midsection of the tower, which is evidently where they were trying to aim the first plane as well, but they couldn't. After that first tower got hit, we were pretty much resigned the second tower was coming down. And then we started discussing the people where they were there. And we were like, well, how many people were there? And I had worked there, and I kind of knew that theoretically there could be 10 to 20,000 people in the towers and the complex around it at any one time. Um, and after the second tower collapsed, I got a call from a friend of mine, and her husband had worked with me at Goldman Sachs, and he still worked down in Lower Manhattan. And she was like, "Have you heard from him?" And I was like, "Oh, no." And she's like, "I don't know where he is." So he would have been arriving at New Jersey Path about 30 minutes before the first plane hit. And for a while, we didn't know where he was. And I told her, I said, look, if I hear from him, and at this point, once the second tower collapsed, all the bridges got closed, no transit out of the city. Basically, if you were in Manhattan, unless you were going to walk across one of the bridges, and the Brooklyn Bridge was really the only one you could walk across, you were trapped in the city. You weren't going anywhere.
Wasn't there an evacuation of Lower Manhattan, though? Didn't the mayor
Well,
order an
yeah, yeah,
evacuation?
yeah. There was, so people had already started to kind of evacuate, um, before Harvey's going to bark a little bit. The mayor had kind of, yes. there was a general evacuation of Lower Manhattan even before the towers collapsed because they needed to get kind of fire and rescue down there. Once the towers collapsed, they ordered a general evacuation of all of Lower Manhattan. So then we started to get a lot of people, and I think Susan assumed that her husband Greg knew where I lived and knew we lived in kind of lower mid Manhattan. Chelsea is where we lived. I think she assumed he would make his way there if he couldn't get anywhere. The problem was cell phone service became almost unusable because the main cell phone tower was on the World Trade Center. So cell phones became very sketchy to use at that point. And eventually I did hear from Greg, and he had made his way. He was on the last PATH train that was supposed to come into the station and was stopped after the second plane hit. And they evacuated him, and he was able to get out on a ferry and kind of made his way home before those services stopped. But and this is what I don't think people who weren't there that day they fail to understand. From the moment that second plane hit, for the rest of that day and into the night, and for the next 2 or 3 days, I think most of us in New York thought we were going to die.
What did you think was coming?
I think, and I've had a conversation with my buddy Dan, who lived in New York as well. I think we all assumed that the reason these towers had been targeted was to draw cameras onto New York City, and then they were going to detonate a small nuclear weapon in the city.
Oh my God. That's
because
scary.
This has been kind of the nightmare scenario since the collapse of the Soviet Union, was that there was theoretically unaccounted for nukes that were out there, especially suitcase nukes. So what does that mean? And we were waiting, and this is, again, I think something people who weren't there don't understand. I mean, for 2 or 3 days, we felt we could die at any moment. Most of us were separated from our families. So Rick was trapped in Princeton. There was no way for him to get back in the city. Many people I knew were trapped various places. Yeah, it was messed up.
I didn't realize that you all had the idea or thought that, maybe there would be an additional attack. I mean, I knew that we were all expecting additional attacks, but I think the way we were talking about it, I was experienced this from the West Coast. And again, I wasn't an adult, but I remember I could hear my parents talking about, like, well, we live near a Navy base, right? Like that could be a target. We live near this or that. That could be a target, right? Like there could be targets all around the country that aren't just New York. And so, I mean, I think that that's like kind of like the egocentrism of everybody. Like we're next, like everybody thinks that they're going to be the next target. But there was I remember there was a lot of talk about, like, is this going to continue? Or are there going to be additional attacks? And the main reason for that, though, I think is important to say, is like there were other attacks. There were 4 planes that were hijacked. 2 of them ended up in New York City. One hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the other was bound for the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and was taken down by passengers in the plane who had heard what was happening, and they fought back against the hijackers, and they took the plane down in, like middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, kind of. And all of the people on board perished, including the hijackers. But that plane was bound for another major target, which was the U.S. Capitol. So we were, as the news was unfolding and we were trying to figure out what was going on, it was clear that there were multiple attackers and that there were multiple planes that had been hijacked. And air traffic control was really trying to get a handle on, like, well, what planes are down, what planes are up, what do we have going on? And so it wasn't just New York City that was attacked, right? So I think that's what expanded this worry, is like, well, what's next?
Well, so once the towers were down and there was this general evacuation, a lot of us kind of moved indoors because this kind of cloud started to spread. And, at this point, kind of became engrossed in CNN as everybody else around the country already was. And I just remember at one point, so this is where I blame the media. First, they all just went overboard, and the stuff they were saying was just, you're not helping the situation. So at one point, I remember them saying, we have 20 planes in the air right now over the continental US, and we're not really sure the status of any of them. And I was like, great. So now
Thanks
people
so
are going to,
much for the panic. Yeah.
yeah. So now people are going to panic. And here's the thing. The targets were symbolic, right? I mean, the World Trade Center, center of capitalism, Pentagon, center of American military might, and the US Capitol building, center of American political might. Very symbolic targets. But everybody in every city and town and burg started imagining whatever was in their town was the obvious next target, which was just ridiculous. Like, I'm not even sure these guys knew where Omaha was, much less what they would
Right.
target there.
Right.
So, I mean, there's this period of unknown thing. And again, remember that night, most of us in New York were assuming well over 10,000 people had died when those towers collapsed. Um, you know, and there was no easy way for families to get in contact with one another. I remember later Rick commenting there were dozens of cars in the parking lot for New Jersey Transit at Princeton. So these are people who had been commuting from Princeton into the city. And many of these people worked in Lower Manhattan. Many of them worked at Cantor Fitzgerald, um, which was a firm that was in the World Trade Center and One World Trade Center. Very tall. So it's an investment bank. I actually had friends who worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. Very close to the impact zone. And he said those cars were never reclaimed. So we thought we were going to die that night. So I remember what I did that night. So it was about 8 p.m. and I finally got through to Rick again. And he was just confirming. He's like, you're okay. I was like, I'm fine. And he's like, you need to get out of the city. And I said, well, that's just not an option. Like, we can't. Like, there's the only thing I could do is go to Brooklyn, walk to Brooklyn. And then what? Like, and he said, well, just be safe. Because I think even he thought this was it. And checked on my buddy Dan. He checked on, like, people started to check on one another. And we kind of started reaching out. And this is where you started to realize, see the gaps in your social circle. You're like, oof, I just hope it's a fact we can't contact one another. But it came, I mean, it was so traumatic. Um, and I worked out 5 days a week prior to 9/11. Um, the great thing about working in investment banks, they usually have really good benefit packages. And one of them was like gym membership to a really good gym. And I would go like every day during the week. And some days I would go in the morning and I would go in the evening. Um, and I would take a break during work to go. And that night I went to the Corners Bodega, the little store on the corner of our street, and I bought a pack of double stuffed Oreos and a carton of whole milk. And I was like, F this. If I'm going to get blown up, I'm going to be happy. Um, because we didn't know. Like, and so New Yorkers did really come together. And my bank that I worked for at that point was really good. They called, they checked on everybody that evening. They were like, we're just checking on you, or because they knew. I mean, it's the investment banking industry in New York is very incestuous. You basically bounce around between banks. Once you're in the system, you don't leave it. And they knew many of us kind of had contacts there. And they were like, look, we're going to be closed for several weeks at least. It's paid. You're not having to take vacation. Take care of yourselves. Check in with us periodically, and we'll keep you updated.
And then the stock market tanked.
And then the stock market tanked. But the good thing is it was something I didn't have to worry about, right? My job was like set aside. I didn't have to worry about that. I didn't have to worry about, oh, I got to go to work tonight or I got to go work tomorrow. Um, there was a little humanity there, which I was happy for. Um, and 2 nights later, Rick still wasn't back in the city. I think it was the third night was when he was finally able to get back in the city. 2 nights later, my buddy Dan came down. He lived on the west side. He came down and we had dinner somewhere. And I remember um, it was close to me. It wasn't down towards lower Manhattan at all. Um, but we just needed to get out and do something. Um, and so show some kind of resilience. Like we're not going to be bullied because at this point we know exactly who it is. Al Qaeda had uh, kind of assumed responsibility for it. We knew a lot about the people and all of these things. Um, we're at this restaurant and we were eating outside, and suddenly, like this throng of people come running up the street, screaming, "It's another bomb! It's another bomb!" And everybody freaked out. And this was basically what the city was like for a while. Um, anytime anything kind of out of the ordinary would be spotted, people would panic and assume this is what was going on. And um, New York was never the same after September 11th. It changed fundamentally. Um, and I remember a few weeks later when I finally went back to work. First, I remember going to work. Um, I went over and got on the bus to go. It was no more than 20 blocks to get. I think it's yeah, it was 20 blocks to get to work. Um, and I got on the bus, and I looking back on it, this was so wrong of me, but I understand why I did it. So I get on the bus and I sit down, and it's a bus I had taken before, so it wasn't like an unknown quantity. I don't know why I didn't take the subway, but I decided to take the bus. I think I was paranoid of being trapped down in the subway if something happened. So I'm on the bus, and this Arabic guy got on the bus, and I could tell every other person on the bus like tensed up, like oh crap, what's going to happen? And my heart started racing. I started sweating. The very next stop, I got off because I was so like, he's going to blow us up, obviously. And I kind of had a discussion with myself after that. Got off the bus and like was like, you need to get it together. That guy was just going to work or coming home from work like anybody else. Like he was no more a terrorist than you are. What is wrong with you? At the same time, I understand why I did it. I understand exactly what was going through my head at the time. Um, but it's funny that day I got to work and it was funny. It'd been 2 weeks, but our whole first week back was basically us just hugging one another and like they brought psychologists and psychiatrists in to help and we had roundtable discussions and all this stuff and like um because it was like citywide trauma.
Well, I think it's important that you brought that up, that visceral reaction you had to seeing somebody, because think of how fundamentally people in this country's lives have changed who were from the Middle East, who were Arabic, who were from these regions. Like their lives shifted so much overnight when they had nothing to do with it, and they were ostracized and they were, um, scapegoated for so long, and still are in some ways. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
at Trump rallies, he was talking about how like, oh, there were people partying on 9/11 or something. Like that's a myth.
Which was not true.
There's no
So
proof of that
liberty,
whatsoever.
right.
And so that's
So
just one of the things that happens, I think, to so many Americans. They become ostracized and scapegoated overnight and feared.
so there were a couple of big enclaves of Arab immigrants living in places like New Jersey, and there were no celebrations there. There was a lot of fear. First, there was anger and angst because they're New Yorkers too. But then there was fear, and a lot of us started to kind of realize those groups are going to probably be targeted by people because they want to lash out at somebody. And if somebody's wearing traditional dress, they're going to be a pretty easy target. So a lot of people I know of who were lived in those communities, they said for at least a year afterwards, they stopped wearing things that identified them readily as Arabic. Um, and many of them, we had an actual friend. He was from Oman, I think was the. I'm pretty sure it was Oman. Um, he said for years afterwards, when people would ask him where he was from, he would say Puerto Rico because he just didn't want to have to deal with that September 11th thing, right?
Yeah, it's
And
really awful.
um, but something people always ask me, and this is another thing that I think you had to be there to experience. So it makes this huge toxic cloud of asbestos and construction material and concrete dust and all this other stuff, which spreads across most of Manhattan, at least the bottom half of Manhattan. But then there's this smell that starts. And the initial smell is like this metallic-y smell, and the jet fuel burning and all these smells. But then there's this other smell. About 5 days afterwards, there starts to be this other smell. Um, we now know that other smell is corpses. And we start, and this is why I said that we thought 10,000 people could have died. It is a relief, and this sounds so cruel to say this. It's a relief when we find out only 2,200 people about had died, because that's a
In New
fifth of
York.
in New York, because it's a fifth of the number we thought had died. Um, Now that's, I mean, it was still awful. And it was tragic, and it was a huge loss of life. But I mean, we could have lost 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50,000 people in that attack. And I think that's definitely what the terrorists wanted.
They were aiming for that, yeah.
They wanted that. I mean, they planned them as post 8 p.m. or 8 a.m., a regular workday. The problem is they didn't do their homework quite enough, because for many students, it was, for many school children in New York, it was their first day of school. So, like the head of Cantor Fitzgerald was taking his daughter to the first day of school. It was primary election day, so people were out kind of voting. It was a nice, pretty day, still kind of late summer. Some people had taken vacation because they wanted to kind of make summer last. Um, all of these things meant there weren't nearly as many people in those towers as there could have been. Um, but that smell, I mean, I will never forget that smell. It, um, it is a haunting smell.
It's interesting that you say smell, because I was thinking the sound would have been what was the most, but yeah,
The
that makes
sound
sense though. I
was,
didn't even think about
well,
that.
I mean, Hollywood had trained me that the sound should have been a lot bigger. So it was a little
I would have
like,
thought there would have
that's,
been like yelling or crying or screaming or booms, collapse. I don't know. That's how I always pictured it, as being just this very loud moment. But you're right. That's what Hollywood prepped me
yeah.
for. So it's interesting.
And well, and it's, fortunately, I was far enough away on 28th Street that I could not see people jumping.
No, thank God.
Some of my colleagues were not so fortunate. They actually saw things like that. Um, and I am thankful to this day that that is something I did not have like indelibly pressed on my brain. Um, but so what do we do with this as historians? Like, what, I mean,
Well, I think it's hard, especially for you, because you have a personal experience there. So teaching about it is always going to be very challenging, particularly when you're confronted with the students with the conspiracy theories, because I've had that happen in my classes too, where they're like, well, jet fuel can't melt steel beams, blah, blah, blah. And like, I'm more able to objectively approach it
Hmm.
because I wasn't there and I was not old enough for it to be, I think, as impactful as it was for many people who were in their adulthood. Um, and even though, I mean, even saying that though, it's still not objective because I do remember it happening. But I think it's really, really hard for you to objectively approach this topic because you were involved in the situation, right? I mean, so it's always going to be difficult for you to teach about it if you have to teach about it. I think as from like a teaching standpoint, I think it's important not necessarily to know like how it felt or what it looked like or what it smelled like there. Although those are all really, really important, like firsthand accounts of things. It's like geopolitically, what does this mean for the world, for international relations, for the way that we move forward, the way that the world changes in an instant. I
Hmm.
mean, everything shifts after that. And I think talking about it in that context, giving the context of the 90s where like we were kind of in this lulled into this false sense of security and like kind of ignoring some problems that were actually happening that we just decided we didn't want to. And then this smacks us in the face. And it's like, no,
Yeah.
you actually are very much going to be involved in this mess. And so I think teaching students in that way to be like, look, you may not have been born, but your whole life has been impacted by this event.
Yeah.
The Patriot Act, the way that you get on and off an airplane, the way we travel, the war that we were in for 20 solid years. We just
The
got out
war
of
on terror.
Afghanistan. I think we
Yeah.
need to talk about that. I mean, that was something huge that happened over the summer, but we end up entangled in a war that's the longest war in US history as a result of these attacks. And what does that mean for the generation? I had
Hmm.
friends, I was in high school when we were invaded Iraq. I have friends who graduated and went off to war. I have friends who were in it for so long, they were in and they retired. I mean, we were in this war for a really, really long time, and it completely shaped, I think, even though we weren't impacted by it day to day, I think it very much shaped our lives for the last 20 years.
Hmm.
So to talk about it in that way is important. That like this is the moment where that started.
It's a moment. So the funny thing is Y2K had happened a year before the September 11th attacks, and Y2K didn't wasn't kind of the apocalyptic moment everybody thought it was going to be. Everybody thought all these computers would stop functioning because of the dates and all of this stuff, and that didn't really happen the way people thought it was going to happen. So the new millennium didn't really feel like a new millennium, but I think September 11th things changed. There's pre September 11th and there's post September 11th. Um, and the war thing is an interesting thing. Americans are overwhelmingly in favor of going into Afghanistan after September 11th. This is where Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda are based. This is
Well, you
where they're
also
operating out of.
had the highest approval ratings for a president in US history post September
I
11th.
hated W. Well, I didn't hate him. I didn't like W, but we all rallied around him
There was a 90% approval rating in the
because
days following 9/11.
and so Americans were overwhelmingly in support of military action in Afghanistan. Now, a few years later, when that gets expanded to Iraq, that's where fractures start to appear because Iraq has nothing to do with September 11th at all. And in fact, if you want to prevent things from September 11th happening, having somebody like Saddam Hussein as a totalitarian dictator is a good thing in places like that. True?
I mean, it's like the evil you know versus the one you don't know, I guess.
Well, I mean, the immediate immediate. Now, long term, we know that these kind of totalitarian regimes kind of beget more problems than they kind of prevent. But the idea is you have kind of a totalitarian ruler who can monitor things like that and put those things down. I mean, if something like that had sprung up in Iraq under Saddam Hussein's watch, he would have quashed it because he can't afford a war like that with the United States. Whereas
Right,
these
because
kind
you
of
could have like these economic sanctions, and there could be a lot of fallout for that because of like a true participation in the geopolitical structure. Whereas these terrorist organizations, like they don't, it doesn't matter to them. You can sanction them all you want. They're not a
right,
part of the global economy necessarily. So, yeah, having someone who's a bad, awful dictator, at least he's somewhat playing the game. Whereas Al Qaeda, that they're just not even a part of that structure. There's no,
mm-hmm,
they're playing outside the bounds of traditional international politics, right? Like you can't really do the traditional things to them,
mm-hmm.
the punishments.
Yeah, and you know, another odd thing starts comes out of this, and it's something we're still kind of in the throes of, although I see it kind of changing a little bit. There's this resurgence of performative patriotism. American flags go up everywhere. And what's interesting is in New York, it's there, but it's not as present as it is other parts of the country. And New Yorkers, I think we were really kind of uncomfortable with it. And we're like, this is our response? Like, put up a flag? That doesn't bring anybody back. Like, why are you doing that? And for those of us who had kind of an interest in history and were paying attention, then we were like, well, I mean, this isn't to say the United States deserves anything like this happening, but I understand why it happened. And I understand the logic the people who did it employed. I think their logic's flawed, but I understand how they came to this decision to do this. And it wasn't random. The United States has a lengthy history of interfering in Middle Eastern politics.
Oh yeah, I mean, going way way back. Um and then there's something to be said about Bush 1, Bush 2, that kind of stuff. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole other topic, I guess. But I like what you mentioned about this performative patriotism that comes out of this, and I think it's like the real. I think we are still very much dealing with it right now. Um,
You don't think it's become a little more bifurcated now? Like, I think there's an assumption now if you're flying an American flag, there are assumptions about you that 10 years ago there weren't.
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it. I've heard people say like it's almost like a symbol of hate at this point, and that makes me really
Mm-hmm.
sad. That's
Yeah.
awful. But I've heard people say that where like if you're driving your big giant truck down the highway and there's an American flag waving out of the back of it, like that person may not be friendly toward you. If
Mm-hmm.
anyway, I don't know. I mean, I think it kind of sprouts up at this time. I did find it to be an interesting reaction to what happened. It was a good thing, I think, because we're so divided right now. I don't know what would need to happen for us to come together in the way that we came
I
together
thought the
after 9/11.
I thought the pandemic would bring us
The
together.
pandemic has not brought us together. It has divided us worse than anything. I mean, I remember, in the day of 9/11 and the days after, I mean, people were just passing each other looking just in a haze. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
everyone looked so sad and so helpless, and I remember very clearly like, people with tears in their eyes. I remember my mom crying. I mean, I do remember that. And there was something that happened that like struck me even at that age of like, wow, this is earth-shattering.
Mm-hmm. New
And
York became a friendlier place for a little
it
while.
was, well, that's nice. There wasn't as much yelling at the sandwich shops.
Well, I mean, people were more civil to one another on
More
streets and
civil.
things.
Yeah, I mean, so that it was kind of a good thing, right? I don't know if there's something that could do that at this moment. I mean, I think we're just so far we're so far gone in terms of being civil to one another at this point. Um,
So the bank I worked at when this happened, so I worked on the 47th floor, 47 or 48. It's funny that I can't remember that number now. I never felt comfortable working on that floor ever again. And in fact, we left New York 2 years later. We left New York in 2003. And a lot of it was like, first, it just felt like the heart of the city had been ripped out. Second, I never felt completely comfortable again. Um, and I remember we flew out to Bermuda in November. And it was the first time we were on a plane since it had happened. And we got on the plane, and it was kind of an odd day in New York. It was a little warm, and the humidity was up. So the vents in the airplane, it was like mist coming out. And this guy in front of us, who was kind of this big, very stereotypical Brooklyn gonzo, started like screaming and panicking, "Fire, fire, there's smoke here, there's smoke here." And the stewardess had to come back and be like, "That's not what's going on at all. That's not the situation at all." Um, but we decided we just had to leave, because it was no longer the city we loved. And not seeing those towers was a daily reminder of it. And um, I have to say also, as far as commemorating it in the city itself, most of my friends in New York, we were all very much proponents of rebuilding it to look exactly how it is as it had looked. We did not want to change in the design. We didn't, we felt the best thing we could do was rebuild it back, learn from kind of the collapse, how to fix that problem, but rebuild it to look the same.
I
As
remember feeling that way. Like I thought that would have been the biggest like fu. It's like we'll
Yeah,
just build it again. But it also in a way feels kind of disrespectful. I
that's
could see
true.
both sides of it. Where it's like,
That's
oh, we're just going to move right on and we're just going to build new towers, right? Like I could see both sides of that argument.
So I have not been back to New York since we left in 2003,
Are you serious? You've not been back there?
except to go through the airport. I've not. I
Really?
it is it's painful. It's like I don't fortunately when we had to fly through there and change flights, it was at night, and I think it was cloudy, so I didn't have to see lower Manhattan. I don't know how I would respond 20 years on to that, because it is a sign of the dozens of people Rick and I knew who never came home that day. Um, and it's a sign of just the city fundamentally changing, and I think in a not good way. Um, yeah, it's
So it's important, I think, for students to know the context and everything that happened. And I mean, I don't even, so when I was thinking about doing this episode, like we could have done like a play by play of like at this time this happened and this time that happened. Like I don't really know how important all of those details are to an event. And that's what I'm kind of stepping back and thinking about. The way I would teach something that happened 100 years ago, I wouldn't necessarily teach in that way.
mhm.
Even though when you look up anything about like, well, what happened on 9/11, it tends to be like a minute by minute report of what went on. And that's just not really the way that we teach about things. We teach about things in a broader context, like what led up to this, what happened, and then what was the fallout or the impact. And I think, we're 20 years out, but I still think we're still too close, and especially for you, to really like zoom out and say, why is this important? I mean, we know it's important, but we're going to analyze this day so differently 50 years from now than we do right now.
Oh, definitely. I think so. I mean, it's so those play-by-play accounts. One of the reasons I really detest them is they are devoid of any humanity. Um, there's not a mention of specific people. Um, it's and these are people who died, right?
Like, think of how we
2,200.
teach about the Civil War. Like we don't go in and talk about like, well, then this person, did this or that. Like
I mean,
we don't really talk about events in that
I
way.
was having a conversation with my doctor this morning. He was asking me about classes this fall and something, and he said something about the COVID death number right now, which we're sitting at about 650,000 today, I think.
Hmm.
And I said, we're inching up to Civil War territory. And he's like, what do you mean? I was like,
I
yeah,
think
we're
it's
getting,
more at this point because there's some estimates that say 600.
well, then
We've
we're,
passed it
we've passed it. And he was like, that many people died in the Civil War? And I was like, yeah, like a lot of people died in the US Civil War. Um,
because all
and
deaths were American deaths, right? I mean, that's
well, yeah, right. I
right.
mean, at
Yeah,
the,
that's like it wasn't just one side or American deaths; both sides were. So it ends up the
right.
numbers are so much more than World War One, World War Two,
Hmm.
Vietnam, etc. And we're also inching toward Spanish flu numbers,
Yep.
which took course
Sure.
over many years. We're a year
Yep.
and a half into this, and we're really inching pretty close to those numbers too. So,
But I mean, this is one thing I don't like when historians talk about these catastrophic events. There's a dehumanization a lot of times that takes place, and you put a statistic there, but you don't have like the experiences and stuff. And I'll go back to a book we've talked about before, Stephanie Smallwood's Saltwater Slavery. I think one of the
mhm.
things she does is try to put a face on the numbers
Well, and
of.
that's why it's so important to find primary sources, which I always
Mhm,
do in all of my classes. Or like when I talk about, the Great Depression, I assign the Hard Times book, right? When I
mhm,
talk about 18th century medicine, I assign Martha Ballard's diary, right? Like those kinds of things. It
mhm,
is so important to put a face on it. But most of the time when we're talking about a major event, like in this case, a terrorist attack, or if we're talking about Pearl Harbor, we're talking about the circumstances that surrounded that event taking place rather
mhm.
than trying to like flesh out individuals who were involved. I think that's what ends up happening.
So one of the things that sticks out to me, even to this day, um, just before the attacks, so there's a mall underneath the World Trade Center, concourse, and one of the things that had just opened not too long before the attacks, there was a Krispy Kreme donut place that opened, and it was only our second Krispy Kreme in New York City, and it was great because it's very different from New York style donuts, and um, and it was just there, and then it was gone, and I know it seems so superficial to focus on something like that, but I think that's the way the human brain functions, is you have to like pick something little. And I think for me it's a lesson for how I approach primary sources about other events, is I understand, particularly if it's a traumatic event, um, that the person writing or whatever might not be able to write everything they're feeling or experiencing. So you do have to do some triangulation and be like, well, look, they're not going to talk about this because that's the thing that's like fresh in their head right now. They're going to talk about this other thing. Um, I will say this: I dread tomorrow. I've avoided news and stuff the last few days because the clips of the towers collapsing and the clips of the second plane impacting the tower, those are things I don't need to see ever again. I don't want to see those. I wish they would start putting warnings up before they show those clips
Do you think it's
to say,
important for
look,
students to see those?
I think for people who've never experienced it, yes. Um,
Is it
but
appropriate to show it to children?
how young?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just generally
I mean, I don't know. I mean,
because they
it
have
is.
questions, like the kids came home and said, we're learning about 9/11. What are you learning about it? And they read this little book, and it's such a sweet little book. I don't know if you've read it. Probably not reading children's books, but it's like it's about a fireboat that had been out of commission for many years, and then like somebody kind of took up this fireboat as a hobby, and then the fireboat ended up helping put out fires during and after in the aftermath. It was a very sweet children's book, but it really dialed down like what actually was happening, but I think it was age appropriate, you know. So I
Right.
mean, I think it's important. I would argue that it's very important for people to see it. Not you necessarily, you were there, but like the kids who don't know anything about it, I think that those images are so important because it
Hmm.
really dials in on this is what happened. This is why everybody's upset. This is why this was traumatic. Um, I mean, I think that kids need to see it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an age where you kind of gradually introduce a thing, and a lot of it has to do with the same conversation we have about like slavery in the United States. Like, if I'm teaching elementary school students about slavery, I'm not going to immediately go to the photos of torture that was done on slaves to show them the kind of violent dehumanization that's part of the process.
See,
I'm not going to
I'm
go to
back
that
and forth on
immediately.
that though, because there were children who endured slavery. And to sugarcoat it or whitewash it or make it a palatable to the kids, first off, I think that
I
it
mean, are we going to
I know
talk
what you're
about?
saying, but at the same time, just like you need to know like why everyone's so pissed about this. It's a serious situation. You know, I
I mean,
don't
are we
think
going to talk about the 20-something-year-old receptionist who jumps out of the World Trade Center, but holds her skirt down so it doesn't fry up? This final moment of dignity.
yeah, I mean, I don't
I
know if
mean,
it's important to
and
talk
you're
specifically,
going to have
but
to talk for a minute because I need a moment here to collect myself.
yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think that, you know, it's not necessarily good to go into all those specific details just for the sake of traumatizing, because I also think that there's a line when we discuss history, when we teach history, where you have to dial back and not be sadistic about it in a way. Like I that's how I felt about 12 Years a Slave when I watched it. It felt very uncomfortable the amount that and I felt the same way when I watched like The Passion of the Christ, where I'm like, this is just taking it to a level of like extremity that to me seems inappropriate. I don't know, like it's almost like I don't know. I think I would call it like torture porn or something along those lines, right? Where it's
It feels gratuitous.
gratuitous. Um, and so I think that, you know, you don't want to take it to that level, but I also think it's important to relay the gravity of a situation. So that way students, they're not blindsided by it. Because so many times when they get into college classes, and then you do talk about like the just the true brutality of what happens at many different historical events, they are blindsided by it, and they've
Right.
gone through life with this privilege of not having to know about it, that to me is
Well,
like you're doing them a disservice because they march through life with all this privilege. Well, I don't have to worry about that. Well, no, you need to think about it from early on, I think.
so I would say this for very young children. I think a way to approach it that would be useful, and it wouldn't whitewash kind of the deaths and the suffering. Um, Show clips or show photos from those candlelight vigils, or the boards where people would set up and put all the pictures of their missing loved ones, or the poles all around the city that had just hundreds of photos taped on them. If you know, Joe, if you see this, please call us. We're trying to figure out where you are. If you've seen this man, could you please call this number? He worked blah 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 at Windows in the World restaurant. Um, that I think is a much more. I think it is a respectful way to kind of talk about the loss of life that day and to move it away. I mean, I'm very much. I don't like to mention the specific names of the perpetrators for the attack. The 93 attack, I'm okay with doing because it was a failed attack. And I think it's important you understand the connections. The actual people who do this one, though, I really am very much the same school as the mass shooter thing of not publicizing the name, not giving them notoriety. Um, I mean, these are monsters, right? Anybody who hijacks a plane to crash into a building is a monster, period. You just are. Um, and granted, I mean, we've ignored what happens at the Pentagon. We've ignored what happens at that field in Pennsylvania. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to be on Flight 93.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
that one, I mean, just, hearing people's voicemails from the flight, calling their loved ones, those
mhm,
transcripts, like it's devastating because they knew what was
mhm,
going on at that point.
yeah.
And
I mean, and
so,
this is the thing. You want to talk about heroes? Those are heroes.
mhm, yeah.
I mean, these are people who understand what they're giving up to stop this.
Well, they know
To
that they're
st-
going to save lives. They know it's not their life, but they're saving
they're saving lives. This
thousands of
is
others.
this is why you should get vaccinated.
Right.
Um, I mean,
But
this is the thing. Those people on Flight 93 storm the cockpit to retake control of that plane, knowing they are going to die in the process, but they're going to prevent other lives.
and have no
If you
idea how to
can't,
fly a plane, right?
right, you can't get a freaking shot in your arm to help prevent the continuance of this pandemic. Like I, if you will not get a shot for COVID and you are not kind of immune compromised or some other reason why you can't have it, you cannot call yourself a patriot. Period. You're not.
Did you know that the virus is now targeting people who are unvaccinated, Jeff?
Yes, I've seen that, and the idiocy that's portrayed by that, it's like that's what a vaccine's supposed to do. Um, but it's just, I mean, this gets back to kind of the aftermath of 9/11 and people, this kind of performative patriotism, right? It's like, oh, we're patriots. And for years afterwards, I remember we went to Tucson, which is where we moved right after New York, and our real estate agents there were showing us stuff. And one of them was like, yeah, we had a tough time here in Tucson too after 9/11 with blah, blah, blah. I was like, give me a freaking break. Really? You did?
I mean, I think people were collectively very upset by it. I think that that is
Sure.
fair to say.
But
But
like,
I don't think we need to, like, yeah.
it's like, but it's, I think I hoped for something good to come out of the experience for the United States. It didn't. Basically, what came out of it was 20 years of vendetta.
Right. Well, and 20 years of incredible radicalization of this group, this
Hmm.
we call a patriot group. And it's interesting with Rudy Giuliani, we didn't really talk about him that much, but had he just disappeared after 9/11 happened, just retired and gone off, he would have been a hero forever. People
Yeah,
loved him in the
yeah,
aftermath.
yeah.
And now he's got, hair dye
Well,
dripping
and
down his
Giuliani
face. And
really 9/11 reformed his opinion for his image for many New Yorkers because he had he had been tough on crime, which is good in the city, but he'd also started. So Chris Rock had this famous piece where he said, "Rudy Giuliani is kind of like a pit bull. Like as long as there's trouble, he's nice to have around, but if there's no trouble, he'll eat the children." And basically, what he did was the Brooklyn Museum was doing this exhibit, this kind of controversial exhibit, and he didn't have anything else really he needed to take care of. So he got involved in that and wanted to cut the Brooklyn Museum's funding because of it. And it's like, and New Yorkers were like, no, you can do whatever you want in some things, but don't touch our art and culture stuff. You're not allowed to dictate that. But 9/11 really gets him back as kind of this popular figure in New York. Um, yeah, if he had retired post 9/11 from public life, he would have been remembered as a hero who kept it together, as
yeah.
opposed to somebody who shaves at a table in an
Oh my
airport.
gosh, I saw that. That was so weird. And
Um,
doing press conferences out of the Four Seasons landscaping with hair dye
yes.
dripping down his face. It's a
Ugh,
mess. The whole thing's a mess. But we're an
but
hour and a half in now. I think we gotta Gotta wrap it
Yep.
up.
Yep. I think this is a little therapeutic for me.
Good.
Um, maybe that's as good as I can hope. But I mean, this is a question historians deal with all the time: is what do you deal with more recent events? Very few events kind of, I think, rise to the scale of 9/11 for us as a country collectively in the last half century. Um, I think Vietnam, the assassinations in the 60s, and World War II are probably the only other candidates over the last 100 years for similar traumatic events. But it's a work in progress, right? I mean, uh, I will be curious in the last years of my life to see how 9/11 is talked about, um,
Me
to
too.
see
I
what's
mean,
left out,
yeah.
to see what's kind of focused on that maybe we didn't even talk about today. Um,
I think it's going to be taught as a
yeah,
unit when we talk about the war in Afghanistan because we've now bookended that. And I think that there'll be a starting
yeah,
point and an ending point in like a US survey class to talk about the war in Afghanistan.
I suppose. I that worries me because I think you're going to move to even further dehumanization of the victims of 9/11, and I think you're going to move towards
Well, I
possibly a
think, but
situation.
can you name victims of Pearl Harbor?
Oh, give me a minute and I can.
You know what I'm saying? Like, can the average American who's gone through primary school, maybe even college, can they sit around and list individuals who were killed at Pearl Harbor? Because a lot of times Pearl Harbor and 9/11 are
Right.
compared.
Which I think is wrong.
I don't think it's right.
Well,
But
here's the
I
thing.
think that
So
that's
the
typically how we deal with these situations.
right, but I mean, here's the fundamental difference. I think is this is the receptionist, the delivery guy, the kitchen staff. These people who die in the towers on 9/11 are civilians. They have not enlisted in the U.S. military. They are not. Whereas the sailors on board, even the Arizona, in on December 7th, 1941, they are in the military. There is an inherent risk with what they're doing. And the United States is in a very precarious position with Japan at that point. Both countries,
I know that there's a huge difference between an attack on civilians and an attack on the military. However, I think that we don't tend to approach that discussion from an individual perspective of like this person, was a sailor on this boat and he came from this family and he did we just don't do that. And I don't think that's right, but I'm saying I think that that's just how it ends up playing out. And I think when you're really close to a situation, you're like, well, that's not right. That shouldn't be the way it is. Well, no, but a lot of times when you're trying to consider and think of like a survey class, how much time are
yeah,
you going to spend talking about one day? Even though that one
yeah,
day profoundly changed your life, to these kids who weren't even alive yet, it didn't. And so,
hmm
to go into really, really, extreme detail to it, pedagogically speaking, may not be the most important thing to do.
or maybe it is, and you show that there is kind of this granular approach that you should maybe do sometimes. That this, particularly when you have a rich source of primary sources, um, and you can kind of
That is
talk
true. There's
about
a lot of rich sources here because after during the 9/11 commission, they recorded how many oral interviews? Thousands,
mhm, yeah,
thousands of oral interviews. So you could do something like a hard times kind of a piece here where you're like, go and listen to 5 oral histories of 9/11 and get
hmm
down into the granular. You absolutely could do that. I'm not trying to be cynical, but considering like 100 years from now in a history of the US survey, I don't know that this would be as watershed of a moment to sit and focus on for like an extensive period of time.
right. I could see it being a class session.
Sure. Yeah. Definitely a
I
clock
still
question.
think I still think 50 years from now there will be kind of 9/11 themed upper div courses
I could see there being an independent study or like an upper division course where you do really dig
or
into
a hit
that.
or a
Yeah.
war on terror upper div US history thing.
hmm But I think that we're going to look
1989
back
to
on this and say, like, our response and our reaction was inappropriate. And what ends up happening in Afghanistan was entirely inappropriate. I don't think we're going to look back on it and say, like, oh, well, we should have done all that stuff. I think we're going to look back at it with a really critical eye, especially
Mhm.
like seeing what's going on in Afghanistan now and what's going to go on for the many years to come. We're going to look back and go, wow, we caused that
Yeah.
because we got upset over 9/11.
Yeah. Well, we should probably end it
Yeah,
on that happy note.
it's been a while. Yeah. All right. Thanks
Well,
for
thank you for joining us. I know this is a little bit of a different episode.
yeah. We'll resume our
Uh,
regular history talk
yeah.
next week.
Um, yeah. I think we're going to talk about the history of the medical profession
Okay.
in the United States starting next week, right?
I am teaching a history of American
We're
medicine
doing,
class right now, so I'm more than happy to do so.
we're going to kind of look at a couple of different points, and including an episode kind of devoted to things like the development of vaccines and things,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
history of
I'm
vaccines.
excited about that.
Um, Go get your COVID shot.
Please
Not
do that.
you.
No, I already
If you're
did.
a
Yeah.
listener and you don't have one, go get one.
I think you just like
Um,
made a not listener by saying that if someone's listening and
well,
doesn't have their
you know
shot.
what? That's fine. They're actually the people who should be listening, but if they're not going to, that's fine. You need to get vaccinated. It's just like
Yeah. It's time.
there's no excuse. There's no excuse at this point. Anyway, well, thanks for joining us. I'm Geoff.
And I'm Hillary. Have a good one.